Hello everyone and welcome to the second DevStream summary video. This was originally streamed on the 8th of October and this was for the release 1.58. The goal of this stream was to get the title data from the game files, then create a page in the app where you can view the titles, their descriptions, their unlocked descriptions, and also add your player name so that you can see what your title would look like with your in-game player name. Unfortunately, there were a few issues that we encountered and we were not able to release the full featured titles page, and so the update 1.58 only has a simplified titles page which shows the title name, title description, and you can set your player name and you can see then your player name in the titles. The update 1.58 is available on Android and iOS from the 9th of October. In the first part of the stream, we were getting the data from the game files, which involves extracting the information using the Mbin compiler maintained by Monkeyman. Once we have the data in a usable format, we then need to translate each of the items that are in there. So for titles, that would be title name, title description, and title unlock description. So we need to translate that into each language. And then we also need to choose the properties that we are concerned with. So there are some properties such as mission event or event that we don't actually want in the app files because we don't have that data in the app. We can always come back and add those features later on, but for now we just want to keep the data that we put in the app as small as possible. We then need to get that data into a format that works best in the apps. In this case, we're just showing a list of titles, so we don't need to do anything special. We're not going to be searching for a specific item or doing a reverse search for a specific item. So the data for this feature is actually quite simple. Even though it's simple, we still have to test it a little bit and make sure that we get all the titles generating properly and with the correct translations. Here we got a little bit stuck because it looked a bit strange the way that some of the titles were being unlocked by a specific item. In this case, we were looking at Friend of Hesperus and it was unlocked by a Friends of Hesperus game item. So there was a little bit of searching being done here and we were trying to figure out why it was kind of pointing to itself. Eventually we did figure out that it is a game item and it's not pointing to itself. So this made me a bit more confident that we were on the right track. After we had the titles being generated correctly in the different languages, we then had to go and add the specific title file to each of the language options. So for example, the Russian titles file would be titles.ru, and I would then go into the RU language file and just say, when you load titles, load this specific file. After that, we just need to tell the apps how to read the actual titles file, how to read each of the specific properties for each of the titles. Before we can actually see the page in action, I first tried to add the feature where you can mark a title as owned. I think this would be a really useful feature. You'd be able to sort by owned or not owned, and that way you can see what titles you are missing and obviously their descriptions on how to unlock them. This information needs to be saved to the device and it would pretty much just be a list of owned titles, and from that we can figure out what you own and what you don't own. The next really important thing that we need to work on is actually choosing a good icon for the draw menu, and I spent quite a bit of time figuring out which icon would really represent titles. I think the one that we ended up going with was really good and suited titles really well, but let me know what you think in the comments. After all that, the page still didn't load, but after a little bug fix, everything was working and we actually got to see the titles page. From here, I keep the emulator open on the right hand side and the code on the left so you can actually see how it evolves. One of the features that were cut from release on that day was the images that were on the left hand side of the titles. Even though I really liked the way it looked, I couldn't keep it in as not every single title had an image. The titles that had an image were based on titles that required you to earn an in-game item, and so there aren't that many that actually require that. An example of this would be the title that you get after acquiring an exosuit. This is definitely a feature that I'd like to come back to, because I really liked the way the images looked, and I have a lot of ideas on how to make some nice looking images for some of the more obscure titles. For example, one of them is to reach level 5 with Gek, and I can just imagine having that Gek faction image, and then on the bottom right have like the number 5, and it just would bring a lot of color to that page and just make the user experience a lot better. The next feature I was working on was putting your player name in their title heading, and you can see on the screen there, if you look very carefully, there's a percentage name percentage in the title heading, and that's pretty much what's going to be replaced with your player name. So your player name needs to be saved to the device so that you don't have to enter it every single time you come to this page. But at the same time, if you navigate to this page and your player name is empty, I'd like a little pop-up to show and ask you to enter a player name. Then it would just make a lot more sense on the titles page, instead of having a strange blank and comma and then the rest of the title. You'd rather want player name, comma, and the rest of the title. This did end up being a little bit of a pain to implement, because the way that the framework works that I'm using for the apps, there isn't really a this page has started, do you want to do something? It's mostly this page has been created, do something, but that could run at 60 frames per second, so you don't want 60 pop-ups appearing per second. So we had to make use of this package that was called AfterViewInit, and all that it would do is that the first time the page is rendered, it would give you the context and allow you to do things on the page like bring up a pop-up, and we use that to ask for the player name, and then obviously save it to the device storage so you don't have to do it again. The next big issue was making the page refresh kind of after changing your player name, and once we got that working, the next thing we had to work on was marking a title as owned or not owned, and that's when the real big bugs started coming in. I had issues where marking something as owned would cause the whole page to refresh, and then we had issues where if we marked something as not owned, then it wouldn't actually disable it, it wouldn't unmark it. And so making the owned and not owned work nicely with the player titles was a little bit of a pain. But once that was working, I decided that I wanted to add a little checkbox selection at the top of the page where you could say only show me owned, or only show me not owned, or show me nothing. Making that work with the player titles as well as ticking things on and off became a real big headache, and I'm going to be speeding up the rest of this video because the stream went over by an hour, and it was mostly to resolve all these visual issues that we were having. At the end, before I made the release, I couldn't get it to work with those 3 features, as well as when you tick something, it would make you scroll to the top of the page, and we really just can't have that. That's really annoying. And so I just disabled a lot of these features, such as the filter by owned or not owned, and the ability to mark something as owned or not owned for the release, just so that we could get it out because we ran out of time. Also, in the last few minutes, we noticed that the description sometimes had %num percentage, which was a placeholder for you to put in the value of the stat that is required. For example, there is a title Wayfinder that is unlocked after 100,000 units have been walked by the player. So in this case, the %num percentage would be replaced with 100,000. We also took some time to make sure that the numbers were formatted nicely so that they're easier to read, and then went through a little bit more testing just to make sure that the titles page with the limited features was still working nicely and that we weren't getting any weird visual glitches. And then it was time to create the release, make the what's new patch notes, and generate the titles for each of the languages, and then make sure that each of those languages are still working in the app and that we haven't introduced any new bugs related to translations. We had an issue like this with the previous stream where we did the recharge by feature. It turned out that some of the items weren't translated properly, and therefore the recharge by items didn't load for the other languages. If you would like to catch one of these dev streams live, I will be streaming them Thursday nights 7 PM GMT+2 on Twitch, link in the description. Special thanks to those who are supporting me on Patreon. You guys are amazing. Everyone who supports me on Patreon will get early access to videos like this, as well as weekly dev updates and some Discord benefits. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful week.